All right, so today we're going to be looking at the Russia-Ukraine war as we head into 2025.
Okay,
And, we always like to do deep dives into specific sources.
right.
You sent me a couple of really interesting sources for today.
Yeah.
An article from the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
a YouTube analysis,
Yes.
and a Facebook post from a historian named Jeffrey Roberts.
Yes, that's right.
So a very eclectic mix of sources.
Indeed it is, and they offer some very different perspectives.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point of this deep dive. We
Right.
really want to understand how these different perspectives are shaping our understanding of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and also shaping the broader geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely, and I think it's particularly important in a situation like this, where there's so much information coming from so many different sources,
Yeah.
to really try to step back and look at the bigger picture and see how those different pieces fit together, or maybe don't fit together.
Right, or where those pieces are deliberately being smashed and, hidden from us.
Exactly.
So let's jump in with that New York Times article you sent.
Okay,
It was titled, "Trump Flips the Script on the Ukraine War."
right?
I was really struck by some of the language they used to describe Trump's attempt to negotiate peace.
Yeah.
It was very pointed. It was very pointed.
Well, they did compare him to Neville Chamberlain,
Yes, that was it.
famously trying to appease Hitler before World War II.
Right, and that comparison is, I don't know, it seems like a little bit of a stretch.
It's a loaded comparison for sure.
Yeah, and this is happening in a context where the war's still going on, right? So,
Exactly. It's not a historical event that we can look back on with hindsight.
right.
This is something that's still unfolding.
Yeah, and it's not just the Chamberlain comparison.
Oh.
They bring up the whole Trump-Russia collusion thing again,
Oh, yeah.
even though we know that's been debunked.
Multiple investigations debunk that.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to fit current events into a narrative that they've already created, regardless of the facts.
It makes you wonder how much of the reporting on this conflict is being driven by these kind of pre-existing narratives.
Yeah, or maybe even a desire for those narratives to continue to be relevant.
It's possible.
But then we have that YouTube analysis from Neutrality Studies,
Right.
which takes a completely different approach.
Yes, very different.
They point out that the New York Times piece frames the West's perspective as if it represents the whole world.
Yes.
And they say, well, what about countries like China and India,
Right.
who are actually benefiting from the situation?
Yeah, who have different interests at stake
Right.
and maybe aren't as invested in seeing one side or the other win.
Right. And the video also challenges the way the New York Times uses polling data
Yes.
to portray Russia as being isolated internationally,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't really the whole story.
Right. It's a much more nuanced picture
Yeah.
than the one that's often presented.
It's a good reminder to be critical of the information we're consuming,
Yeah.
especially when it's something as complex and emotionally charged as war.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the emotions of it
Right.
and to maybe not think as critically as we should.
And what's interesting is that the video also brings up this idea of war psychosis.
Yes.
Have you heard of this?
Yeah, it's this idea that in times of conflict, people can develop a kind of tunnel vision
Okay.
where they only see things in terms of black and white, good versus evil.
So you mean they get so invested in one side winning,
Right.
they kind of lose sight of the bigger picture?
Exactly.
Wow.
And the complexities of the situation.
And that can make it very difficult to have any kind of rational discussion.
Or to even consider alternative solutions.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how did the other sources you sent, the
Yeah.
ones by Matthew Blackburn and Alexander Tito,
Right.
how do they fit into all of this?
Well, those pieces offer a different perspective again,
Okay.
focusing more on the military realities on the ground
Okay.
and the potential ramifications for Europe.
It's almost like we're piecing together a puzzle here
Yeah,
with all of these different pieces of information,
I like that analogy.
trying to understand the bigger picture
Yeah.
of what's really going on.
Absolutely. And each piece offers a unique insight, I think, into the evolving dynamics of this conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this so fascinating, because
Yeah.
it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the entire global order.
It has implications for the whole world
Yeah, and how those dynamics are shifting and changing.
and how we understand those dynamics.
Right, and how we understand them.
Because our understanding is shaped by the information that we're exposed to.
Right, and who's providing that information and what their motivations are.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we really need to be mindful of.
Yeah, as we try to make sense of this incredibly complex and ever-evolving situation.
It's not easy.
No, it's not, but it's important.
It is.
Okay, so let's dive into those other sources and see what they reveal about the military realities on the ground and what that might mean for the future of this war.
Sounds good.
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've talked about the narrative surrounding the war, but let's dig into what these sources say about the situation on the ground. I was really struck by Alexander Tito's analysis in that Facebook post you shared. He seems to suggest that a ceasefire might actually benefit Ukraine more than Russia at this point.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take, and one that you don't often hear in mainstream coverage.
Right.
Tito argues that while both sides are obviously facing challenges, the Ukrainian military is in a particularly precarious position right now.
Oh, okay.
They're dealing with manpower shortages, overstretched supply lines, and a lack of certain key weapon systems.
He even mentions that, like, many Ukrainian units are operating at less than half their intended strength.
Yeah, that's a pretty alarming
It
statistic.
is.
And meanwhile, Tito points out that Russia has spent the past year regrouping, replenishing its forces, and fortifying its positions. So he believes that the Russian command is likely preparing for a major offensive in the coming months.
So if that's the case, continuing to fight without a clear path to victory could lead to even greater losses for Ukraine.
That's Tito's argument.
Wow.
He suggests that these calls for continued fighting without any realistic plan for pushing back the Russian advance could actually be detrimental to Ukraine's long-term interests.
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
It makes you question whether the current hardline stance of some Western leaders is truly in Ukraine's best interests.
Yeah, it's a valid question, and one that more people should be asking.
Mm-hmm.
Tito isn't alone in this assessment. Matthew Blackburn, in his article for the National Interest, also expresses concerns about the sustainability of the West's current approach.
Yeah, Blackburn seems particularly critical of what he calls the pro-Ukraine commentariat,
Right.
foreseeing to these unrealistic expectations about the outcome of the war.
He argues that there's this kind of moral panic driving the narrative,
Right.
which is leading to these dangerous calls for escalation without a clear understanding of the potential costs and consequences.
He even mentions the Polish foreign minister, suggesting that the conflict could drag on for another decade.
Yeah, which is a horrifying thought.
Yeah, it is.
And Blackburn's point is that Europe simply doesn't have the military capacity to sustain that kind of prolonged conflict, especially if the U.S. starts to scale back its involvement.
Which it seems like they might be doing based on what we've discussed earlier.
Exactly. And Blackburn warns that continuing the war without adequate U.S. support would be incredibly risky for Europe and could ultimately lead to greater instability in the region.
Yeah, he also emphasizes a point that I think is often overlooked. Lasting peace in Europe is impossible without including Russia in the equation.
Right. It's a perspective that challenges the current approach of isolating and demonizing Russia. But it's an essential point to consider if we're genuinely interested in finding a sustainable solution to the conflict.
And this all ties back to that idea of war psychosis that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
If we're caught up in this use versus them mentality, it becomes much harder to see the nuances of the situation and consider alternative paths to peace.
You're absolutely right. It's like we get so focused on winning that we lose sight of the human cost of the conflict and the potential for finding common ground.
So given all of this, what can we as individuals do to make sense of this complex situation? It can feel overwhelming trying to sift through all the information and conflicting narratives.
Well, that's what critical thinking becomes absolutely essential.
Yeah.
We can't just passively absorb information. We need to actively question it, challenge our assumptions, and seek out diverse perspectives.
Like what Jeffrey Roberts is doing with his curated mailing list.
Exactly. He's actively seeking out alternative sources of information and perspectives that might not be readily available through mainstream channels.
So it's not just about consuming more information.
No.
It's about being more discerning about the information we choose to consume.
Right.
And the sources we trust.
Absolutely. And it's about being willing to engage with ideas that might challenge our preconceived notions. It's not always comfortable, but it's essential if we want to develop a nuanced and informed understanding of the world.
It seems like this deep dive has really highlighted the importance of seeking out diverse viewpoints and not just relying on a single narrative, especially when it comes to something as complex as war.
It's so important to be aware of our own biases and how they might be shaping our perceptions. We all have them, and acknowledging them is the first step to thinking more critically.
I'm already starting to look at the news differently after exploring all of these sources. It's like I'm seeing things with a fresh perspective.
That's fantastic to hear. That's the whole point of these deep dives, to encourage a deeper level of engagement with the information we encounter and to empower ourselves to form our own conclusions.
It's definitely been a journey, and I feel like I've learned a lot already, but I'm also left with a lot of questions, especially about the future of this conflict and the potential for peace.
And that's a great place to be. Asking questions is the key to continued learning and growth.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered, from like the media spin to the boots on the ground reality. It's like we zoomed out from the headlines and now we're looking at this whole landscape of the conflict.
It is a very complex landscape, yeah, full of shifting alliances and hidden agendas and unintended consequences. What resonated with you the most from all of this?
Honestly, it's that sense of cognitive dissonance. Like, how these contradictory narratives about Russia's power can exist side by side. Blackburn argued that somehow both teetering on collapse and poised to dominate Europe, like, it's almost paradoxical.
And that's where the concept of war psychosis becomes so relevant. When emotions run high, it's easy to get swept up in those simplistic narratives, those good versus evil binaries. And we become less likely to question the information that we're being fed, even if it's contradictory or logically flawed.
And that's how propaganda thrives, right? It feeds on that human need for certainty, even if that certainty is built on like a foundation of fear and misinformation. But these sources, even with their differing viewpoints, they're forcing us to confront that discomfort, to embrace the messiness of reality.
It's in that space of discomfort, that willingness to wrestle with ambiguity, that real learning and growth can happen. It's like those optical illusions where your brain wants to see one thing, but with effort, you can shift your perspective and perceive the whole image.
So what does this all mean for someone like me? Or anyone really trying to make sense of the world? Are we all just destined to be caught in the crossfire of these competing narratives?
Not at all. I think these sources provide us with tools to navigate this informational landscape. They remind us to be skeptical, to actively seek out diverse voices, even those that challenge our assumptions.
It's like Jeffrey Roberts showed us curating our own information streams, whether it's through academic networks or reputable publications like the National Interest. It's about taking control of our understanding instead of letting it be shaped by algorithms or sensationalist headlines.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that knowledge is an active pursuit, not something that's passively downloaded. It takes effort, but the rewards are immense. A clearer, more nuanced view of the world, and the ability to make more informed choices.
This deep dive has definitely been eye-opening for me. And it's not just about the Russia-Ukraine war, it's about how we approach any complex issue.
Precisely. And as this conflict continues to evolve with potential power shifts and calls for a more pragmatic approach in Europe, it's crucial to maintain that critical mindset.
Which leads us to the ultimate question, given everything we've discussed: what might a realistic peace in Ukraine even look like? And what are the long-term implications for global security, not just the immediate headlines, but those ripple effects that could play out for years to come?
That's a question for all of us to grapple with, using these insights as a starting point. Don't settle for easy answers or prepackaged narratives. Dig deeper, challenge assumptions, and keep that critical lens polished. The stakes are simply too high to do otherwise.
This deep dive has been intense, but incredibly valuable. To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope it's equipped you with a better understanding of the forces shaping this conflict and the tools to navigate them. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep those minds engaged. Until next time.